Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I am Professor Trina Jones, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third of a series of events which are part of the Meals Conversation Series on Race. The conversation series is sponsored by Amos Mills, an alum of Duke Law School who's seated here on the front row. So we thank you very much for your support of this program. The series is named the Jean E. and Christine P. Mills Conversation Series on Race in honor of Mr. Mills' sister, Jean, and his mother, Christine, who were both extraordinary women committed to social justice and academic excellence. So this is named in their memory and done in their memory. I met Mr. Mills a number of years ago, and at that time he expressed concern about the lack of conversation about race in this country, a concern that has been mirrored by Barack Obama and others over the last week. And we decided to put together a conversation series designed to bring together people from all walks of life, not just academics and not just students, but activists in the communities and other persons who are in the community and other persons who are interested in issues concerning race and gender and social justice more broadly. So this is designed not to be an intellectual academic discussion, but a real discussion where you get to share your experiences and our speakers get to share theirs as well. As a result of that design, a conversation series, the speakers actually only speak for a short time, and then we open it up for a dialogue. So that will constitute most of the program today. We are extraordinarily lucky to have with us two very prominent, renowned, highly respected scholars to introduce the topic today, which is hip-hop culture, a convenient scapegoat or a contributor to inequality. Unfortunately, I received an email from Professor Perry, Imani Perry, about an hour ago. Her flight was sent back to Philadelphia for an emergency landing, and unfortunately, she's safe. She can't be here as a consequence of that, which of course makes me a bit nervous because I wanted some gender representation on the panel, and I cannot sit in for Professor Perry because she is just such a tremendous presence in this particular area and more broadly. But I think that these two men, having read some of their work, will be more than sufficient to cover some of the gender issues that I'm sure Professor Perry would have teased out. We have Professors Mark Anthony Neal and Mario Barnes here to get the conversation going. Let me tell you a bit about them. Professor Barnes earned his BA and his JD from UC Berkeley, and he joined the University of Miami Law Faculty in 2004 after receiving an LLM from the University of Wisconsin, where he was also a Hastie Fellow for a number of years. He's a prolific scholar and teacher, writing in the areas of criminal law, constitutional law, national security law, and race and the law. What's really interesting, beyond what I've already said about Professor Barnes, is that he's a 12-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, and whenever we have interactions, I'm always astonished by that. Prior to leaving military service, he served as a prosecutor, defense counsel, a special assistant U.S. attorney, and deputy Admiralty Counsel in the Office of the Judge Advocate General. He also served on the commission that investigated the 2000 terrorist bombing of the USS Cole. Other than his terrific scholarship and good humor, what I appreciate most about Professor Barnes is the commitment that he has demonstrated to legal education through his activism and mentoring of students and young scholars. And for that work, he was awarded the American Association of Law Schools Minority Group Section Derek A. Bell Award this year for excellence in teaching, scholarship, and activism. Professor Mark Anthony Neal is, like Professor Barnes, to put it in one word, awesome. He is a pioneer. I said, like Professor Barnes, they're both awesome. I hope you caught that, right? Okay. He's a pioneer in the developing field of Black popular culture. He is a professor here at Duke, and I'm so happy that he was willing to come over to the law school. He's in the Department of African and African American Studies, and he's the director of the Institute for Critical U.S. Studies. His focus is Black popular culture, Black gender and queer theory, and Black intellectual production. He's a widely sought-after lecturer, appearing on NPR and Notes with Ed Gordon frequently, and he's written a number of incredible books that I would recommend to all of you, which are listed on his website, which is newblackmen.blogspot.com. Okay, and if you'd like to get a list of his publications, you can go there. So without further ado, I'm so happy to introduce you to Professors Barnes and Professors Barnes and Neal. And Professor Barnes is going to go first.
Am I mic? Well, first I would like to thank Trina for inviting me to participate, and Mr. Mills for making this all possible. And my remarks are going to be about a particular claim or charge about hip hop related to the genre's use of offensive speech. So recently, hip hop has been blamed or accredited as providing cover for a number of whites who have insulted blacks in a language that is common and or frequent within hip hop or rap music more specifically. And I'm sure we in this room are very familiar with the Don Imus controversy, where he referred to members of the Rutgers women basketball team as nappy-headed, and I won't fill in the word that came after that. But as part of the media backlash toward that, many questioned why we were so critical of Mr. Imus when he was using language that was commonplace within the hip-hop and rap genre and vernacular. And so on some level, it became a discussion about who can say what. Why is it on the one hand, rap artists, those who participate in hip-hop culture, use these words without being attacked, where when Mr. Imus uses them, somehow they're more offensive and or insulting. And so not only was it a comment or a dialogue about who can say what, further, there were a number of blogs in print and news media pieces that started to take a closer look at the sort of black male archetype within hip hop and making claims about that it was itself sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, and that if we were going to have a fair and open conversation, that we must hold hip hop accountable as well as Mr. Imus, who lost his job to go on to a much more lucrative job. I started having conversation about, well, is this what social contact has brought us? This notion that hip-hop culture and the production of hip-hop and rap has in some ways become far more universal, speaking across race, stemming from the inner city, but being a commonly experienced expressive art form, culture, pop culture moment and or movement. Were we now going to have to start looking at challenging hip-hop on the images it's responsible for and in the way in which it uses language? Because I saw this claim that essentially what happened is in some ways people like Imus, their language is sanitized because hip-hop uses the same type of epithets or derogatory language, and so we can't have a double standard. And it would have been only a conversation about pop culture, social contact, music, and cultural production if it weren't also that last summer a particular criminal case in New York caught my eye. And this case was a case involving Mr. Nicholas Manucci. Mr. Manucci, a resident of the Howard Beach section of Queens, an area that has its own sordid spotted past with racial violence, attacked a young black man, Mr. Glenn Moore, with a baseball bat because they thought he was committing a crime, but still he attacked him with a baseball bat. And as he beat him, he spewed a number of racial epithets, including the N-word, and Mr. Moore ended up with contusions all over his body and 2 skull fractures. Mr. Manucci was charged with a number of offenses, including a hate crime. And the support for the hate crime was essentially his use of the racial epithets and the N-word. And boy, did I have a jaw-dropping moment when I saw what Mr. Manucci's defense was for why he hadn't participated in a hate crime. He suggested that he wasn't using the words in an offensive way, not loaded with racial animus. He was using the word in the way he had heard it growing up in and around hip-hop culture and rap music. And so it was the benign form of the N-word he was using. Say what? So Manucci's claim essentially was that, hip-hop has remade the world with regard to offensive speech so that we can divorce certain words that in previous times might have been understood as racist or misogynistic. We can divorce them from their past of animus, and we can do so both within race and across racial lines. And so I thought a really great comment on Manucci's claim was provided by Professor Patricia Williams of the Columbia Law School, who said, "Manucci likes this acontextual take on the word. Indeed, it is the cornerstone of his defense against the hate crime charge. Manucci just loves hip-hop and high-fiving and basketball to death, the bat notwithstanding. He is a soulful, born-again Neal kinsman of Ludacris. He claims to have utilized the N-word's most casual and non-confrontational connotation when inquiring if Mr. Moore, the victim, might possibly have lost his way." I think she pokes fun at what is the disturbing kernel of truth there, right? In which the great irony that this person is now bringing this as his essential defense for a hate crime. And, the case just gets better because to add support or lend support to his claim, he introduces his star witness, Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy, who resurrected a central claim from his book, Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word, where he testified that the meaning of the word is context dependent. So in a way, he's lending some academic or theoretical support for Manucci's claim that hip-hop made him do it. So at bottom, I come to the Imus incident and the Manucci defense with a critical eye and ask the question whether hip-hop is responsible for divesting hateful words of their power to oppress. And I think that it's not a ridiculous endeavor to talk about this, especially now where so many criminal and civil cases involve unusual uses of once vilified words related to both gender subordination and racial animosity. And so what I started to do was to look at cases that were pending that involved some claim of the use of a racial epithet or some demeaning word with regard to gender or sexuality, and ask whether there would be other instances where people could raise this type of Manucci defense claiming hip-hop made them do it, and would this mean we were moving toward a moment where hip-hop would be responsible, or at least claim to be responsible, for the loss of the sting of these words, the cultural production of hip-hop essentially contributing to a world where the N-word and the B-word and the words like those used by Imus cannot be claimed to be insulting, provocative, or otherwise wounding. And so I was disturbed in that I found there were a number of cases where similar types of claims could be made that were pending. When I gave a talk similar to this in January at the Association of American Law Schools conference, I opened the newspaper that morning and saw that in the case involving former New Jersey Knicks player Jason Williams, there was now an issue involving a racial epithet where one of the officers related to the case had, under some circumstance, uttered the N-word. And I remember being in law school in the OJ moment where, that clearly meant something. It meant something not just for the individual, but it meant something tainting for the entire investigation. It actually may have been the definitive kind of evidence which helped to secure his acquittal. But in this Williams case, the lawyers for Williams, well, we have to ask about what it means and in what context, and if it's just him, it might not mean anything more. And so this whole comment on we're now to the point that Kennedy suggested we might be at, where we have to ask what it means, might owe some of that to hip-hop, right? Have we so sanitized and desensitized with our music and our cultural production these type of words that you can no longer get up on a soapbox in a part of a criminal case and scream, this creates a problem per se? Is that where we've come to? And if that weren't problem enough, I found another opportunity to ask about, well, is hip-hop implicated in the unfortunate civil matter related to Isaiah Thomas, where he makes what some people think is a crazy claim that while, a cross-racial use of the B word, especially where a white man is using it with regard to a black woman, would be problematic, that's not true where it's, the race of the utterer and the subject or victim are the same, and essentially in this case black. And I think there is a way in which that actually mirrors a kind of argument that stems from hip-hop, right? And that we have rules that are different with regard to intra-racial use of words that we wouldn't accept as allowable interracial. And so there's ways in which if he wanted to, he could use a Manucci sort of claim to say, and I'm not crazy when I say the B word is now context dependent. Now, I do like the fact that my friend, Professor Angela Onwachi-Willig of the University of Iowa College of Law on blackprof.com essentially called him crazy with the post entitled, Who You Callin' a? Thank you to Queen Latifah and hip-hop culture for that indictment. And so I started to think about what do we do now with this sort of claim about the ways in which hip-hop can be used as a scapegoat, maybe, for the sanitization of language that once was thought to be per se oppressive. And usually what I do now is turn to Imani and say, and your work addresses this, so I could skip over the parts of this where I would talk about the popular defense of hip-hop. But she not being here, I will do some work to explain why we might not so quickly be able to scapegoat hip-hop over this point of whether they have now, through their common use of certain words, provided a space of coverage for other types of usages of those words. And so I think there's at least two common or popular defenses. And on the one hand, people simply argue that to make claims about hip-hop's use of expressive language is ahistorical and acontextual with regard to making a similar or crossover argument in a legal arena, right? Hip-hop is not about the same type of space or the same type of issues as we would see in courtrooms related to defenses or claims about conduct where legal regimes are mapped over conduct. Hip-hop at bottom is an expressive conduct that in some parts, it's about political consciousness, but other times it's just about a narrative about inner city life, about urban culture, which includes all the parts of that, not just celebration, but also the underbelly of what some would consider to be glorification of sex, drugs, violence, and a type of materialism. And so you could just make a claim that this expressive world is not meant for the world, an analogy back to the world of the law, of legal structure. The narratives aren't the same. So it's not right to have a conversation about the way in which hip-hop culture uses words as a part of its cultural production as a comparison to what happens in legal cases and the law. The problem with that is, all culture can be represented in the spaces of law, and hip-hop will not be immune from that type of borrowing or taxing. But the other claim that I think perhaps is stronger is that the meaning of these words and the use of these words is very different in hip-hop, and no matter what the manner uttered, they don't have the same power to oppress necessarily. They aren't invested with the same type of animus. They aren't, the producers don't have the same power or position in a hierarchy to do as such bad things with the words. And there's also this way in which we just have to acknowledge that certainly if we're talking about the inner city production and the use of words, that the ER on the end of the N-word is very different than the A. And what that means, and as far as a point of identity adoption, is very different. And so it is dangerous and perhaps not inappropriate, but would be unwise to suggest that we could look directly to hip-hop, talk about the ways the words are used, and then simply say that provides cover for how words get used in other spaces, including some sort of legal sanction of an expanded use of what were once thought to be per se subordinating words. And so essentially it's a claim about the power. And the third claim, Paul Butler, who I also was on a panel with from George Washington University talking about these type of issues, has made. Part of the issue with saying that we can use hip-hop as a sanitation or scapegoat for anything has to be cut off at the point of really now what we have is the commodification of a genre for the benefit of the masses. And it doesn't belong to a particular community in the way it once did, and that most rap music is produced for middle-class suburban whites. And so it's ridiculous when you think about the notion of it being produced for an audience for material gain for using it in this way. But I'll say as my time is wrapping up that it is clear that the participants within the community itself are somewhat conflicted over what to do with this whole issue of we using the words in a particular way is creating problems that we hadn't intended, because Russell Simmons and his hip-hop Summit Action Network have recently issued a press release where they have called for all artists to remove the B word, the H word, and the N word from all of their music, to do so voluntarily without regulation, even though they understand the First Amendment expressive nature of the art form. They claim it is a responsibility that hip-hop owes the community to remove the words because of the damage they're doing to certain communities. And in the press release, they say the African-American community and African-American women in particular. And so there is a way in which even those who are part and parcel of hip-hop are suggesting we do have some responsibility, and I think part of it is because of the dangers. But I think this Manucci and sort of Imus problem are a new danger, a danger we didn't anticipate, that by you using this as a part of your expression, you have given the green light to others to use it in ways that mask or may tend to mask subordination. Okay, so I think...
I got a couple of comments. I got a critique of Mr. Simmons.
Oh, okay.
But we'll save that for later, because that press statement presumes that sexism, misogyny, and homophobia, is not something that can be articulated unless it's articulated with specific words. Right, and if you listen to things that we would define as misogynistic hip-hop lyrics, you don't have to use the B word or other epithets, right, in order to articulate a certain notion of sexism and misogyny. So I have a critique there, right? And then, Randall Kennedy, some of us have a running joke about that book, in that, and it's ironic that he got called upon in that particular case, because if you've read the book, he spends about 3 pages on hip hop. So some of us have been joking for a long time that he was the wrong nigga to write the book.
Okay.
That said, on to my own comments. I often in these conversations want to get down to an issue of specificity. In this case, when we're talking about hip hop, we're talking about a multifaceted cultural movement that is nearly 40 years old. That comprises, generally folks talk these days about 5 major elements. In the visual arts, graffiti, et cetera, in the context of dance, break dance in the context of music, what we know of as rap music, in the context of intellectual production, right? And if you see the number of books that have been produced on hip hop in the last 5 years, you just have a certain kind of example of that. And what we're most concerned about amongst these four elements is, in fact, rap music. I mean, that's what this critique and conversation is about, separate and distinct from these other wider expressions of hip-hop culture. Ernie Panicoli, who's made his living the last 30 years or so being one of the primary photographers of hip-hop artists, has often argued that rap music is the bastard child of hip-hop culture, right? The kind of part of hip-hop that's kind of been taken away from the rest of it and been poisoned in certain kind of contexts. But on the question of rap music, again, being a little bit more specific, much of the commentary also has to do with what is the most visible and commercially viable forms of hip hop that's being produced by the highest paid purveyors of hip hop. And when you talk about it in that particular context, what you are talking about, in fact, is a very small percentage of hip hop. So we spend a lot of time talking about what an Eminem or Ludacris or Snoop Dogg, again, the highest paid purveyors in the context of what hip hop is. But that in and of itself, that which is available in the marketplace, that which you hear on your Hot 90 this and your hip hop this station, that music represents a very small percentage of hip hop that's being produced in this country and globally at this point in time. In fact, much of hip hop that's being produced you'll never hear on the radio. You'll never see a music video for. You're more likely these days to find it on places like MySpace, as example, places where you can download it. So I think that's always important to put that in a particular context also. But it is a question about accountability, right? And I've made much of my career, at least around these questions of popular culture and hip hop, around my own critiques of sexism, misogyny, and homophobia, that's particularly being produced by black male artists, whether it's in the context of music or hip hop or a range of other things. So I'm clearly on board for this notion of accountability. I think as critics and scholars and activists and just everyday fans, we need to speak back to these artists and speak back very forcefully. But we also can't speak back to them in the context of a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that your average rap artist, right, virtually has very little power to get their own music played on the radio, to get any of their music videos played on a video channel, right? So very often we're targeting specific artists, but never targeting the larger corporate interests that generate a huge amount of profits on the circulation of these narratives coming out of hip hop. If we're talking specifically about the recording industry, there are basically four major transnational conglomerates that are responsible for 80% of the music that you can buy commercially in this country right now. Right, four companies, 80% of all the music. Of the music that's played on the radio, commercial radio, regardless of genre, right, virtually 100% of that music is paid for, but not by the artists, right, by these larger conglomerates, right? So what you're talking about, and again, the question about these conglomerates, and we'd essentially be talking about Sony, Warner Brothers, though Warner Brothers and Sony are partnering with each other, so they're actually one company in this regard. BMG, Bertelsmann, where you find places like Arista, and of course Universal. So you're essentially talking about three corporations that are responsible for all the music that we hear commercially in this country, all right? And when we have conversations about holding hip hop accountable, very rarely do we parse right, in language that deals with who these corporations are and who their board of directors are and who is benefiting from the circulation of this music. In the context of radio, this idea that you pay for what gets played actually has been illegal since 1961. It's called Payola. And at the time that Payola emerges in the early 1960s, it's this kind of paying for music is explicitly used as a way because there were fears that too many white kids were being exposed to black music. What we were having was cultural miscegenation. So the way that forces tried to undermine this kind of connection between black kids and white kids and the same music was to make it illegal, right, via Roger Freed, who was a popular DJ in Cleveland, who often played rock and roll music and was responsible for breaking a lot of black acts in the context of mainstream American music. So it's been illegal since 1961 for a record company to go into a radio station and pay directly a DJ to play music unless they explicitly articulate the notion of that relationship to their listeners. What record companies have done very effectively over the last 20 years has developed a middleman process, where they will pay independent promoters to promote their music, and the independent promoters will go to the radio stations, and cocaine and women and trips to the Bahamas and cash and a range of other things get paid in order for music to be played. And what I'm saying in this context is you have a situation where the artists themselves are not financially in a position to get their music played. Their corporations are, right? And very often we lose context of that in the conversation. Even in the context of radio, right, in which you look at conglomerates like Clear Channel, which owns over 1,000 radio stations in this country. You can look at Radio One, which is kind of a crown jewel of the black capitalist view of the world, but I would argue is actually more damaging in their programming strategies than Clear Channel is in terms of relating to black music. But again, giving this kind of pay for play, you have a situation where artists are not out there, they can't get their own music on the radio, right? So what you have are artists who very often are recording in a vacuum, right? Who are recording music just like any of us could record something that would be offensive, but any of us could record that's offensive and not have the capacity to mainstream it in the way that you're hearing it 18, 19 times a day on a mainstream radio station. Why this is important? Because when you look at the political economy of these corporations, where the average artist, and again, this is regardless of genre, essentially sign deals in which they're guaranteed 7% of all the royalties that's generated from their recordings. Out of that 7%, which is very often offered up as an advance, they're often paying for production costs, for studio costs, and even publicity for their own projects, right? Which means artists themselves are hamstrung in terms of what they can record based on what the marketplace demands. Right? And if the marketplace demands certain kinds of offensive lyrics in rap artists, what you get is certain kinds of offensive lyrics amongst rap artists, right? Because they have very little wiggle room in order to push back. We could ask and demand that artists be much more conscious in terms of what their lyrical content is. We could demand it to be much more responsible, but what we know based on where the recording industry is there now, there actually is no marketplace to be able to sustain them economically to do that kind of music. Right? And if you're talking about artists in which recording music is in fact their primary livelihood, they actually have very little wiggle room. In fact, Courtney Love, a member of the group Hole, said it very interestingly about 7 years ago. She described the recording industry as sharecropping. Right? Now, if you have a white woman critiquing the recording industry within that context, right? You could imagine how that plays out for other kinds of artists, right? And even in the context of the recording of the music for the artists, they actually have very little control over what ends up on their recordings. So they may go in the studio and record 35 tracks, right? For a CD, we'll have 15 tracks. They actually have very little say, right? Unless you're a particular artist, right? They actually have very little say on what 12 tracks are going to be included on that recording. And in most cases, for the average rank and file rapper, right? And again, this goes for across the board in terms of music genres. They may have the ability to fight for maybe 1 or 2 tracks on their own albums, right? Because it's all dictated by the record company saying, what can we make money off of? What can sell, right? And you, JayZ, right, making this song about Katrina, Minority Report, you're JayZ, so you have the right to do that recording, right? But we're not going to push that, right? And this is from someone who's like, at the time, was the president of his own label, right? And I always like to put into context when we talk about these quote unquote black label owners, somebody is signing their check. Somebody signs
Puffy's check?
Somebody signs Puffy's check, right? Somebody signs JayZ's check, right? All these folks who have basically taken advantage of what we call boutique labels, right? Something that was conceptualized brilliantly in the 1970s by Kenneth Gamble and Leon Huff, Philadelphia International Records, where they did the work in terms of finding the artists and developing the music, but a larger corporation, in the context of them, Columbia, CBS, was responsible for getting that stuff into the marketplace, right? And when you get to the late 80s and see the emergence of Jam and Lewis and L.A. Reid and Babyface, and then Puffy and all these range of folks, what they're essentially running are boutique labels in which they are basically middle management, right, within the context of these larger corporations. The other thing that I want to point to as we look at these kind of attacks and critiques of hip hop at this particular moment, which I find odd, right, in my view, right? On some ways, the kind of criticisms about sexism and violence and misogyny in hip hop are not new. Joan Morgan wrote her book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, My Life as a Hip Hop Feminist, in 1997. right? That's 11 years ago, right? So this is not a new conversation. If you go back to Patricia Rose, who writes a groundbreaking essay in 1989 called Never Trust a Big Butt and a Smile. Again, 19 years ago, right? It's the first explicit critique, right, of gender relations and sexism and misogyny in black popular music. Patricia Rose, of course, writes the first dissertation in hip hop, becomes a book in 1994, Black Noise, right? So this is not a new conversation, right? The fact that someone like Gwendolyn Pugh, my colleague at Syracuse University, could co-edit with 4 other women a book called Homegirls Make Some Noise, the Hip Hop Feminist Anthology, and have 450 pages of writing explicitly dedicated to a feminist critique and embrace of hip hop suggests that these are criticisms that have existed on the ground for a long time. What I found interesting is that somehow the pushback that we get from Imus, right, where suddenly the conversation shifts from what Imus said to this critique of hip hop. And I have no doubt in my mind that the corporate interests in which Imus worked for, right, instructed him to flip the conversation that way, right? Imus is an interesting cat. He's not that smart, though, right? But also when you see Congressman Bobby Rush hold his hearings in the House, right? And this is interesting, right? You know, there's lots of times when the House could have weighed in, right? It was a weird kind of moment, right? It's like the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas thing, right? Where suddenly you have all these white men in Congress interested in what's happening to a black woman. And it's really odd that in 2007, you have all these folks in the House of Representatives want to have and sit down and have a conversation about the concern of the welfare of black women. And it's like, okay, why is this a conversation about like wages and childcare and healthcare, right? Why is this a conversation about rap lyrics, right? So I was wondering about what's going on in terms of this particular pushback against hip hop at this moment. And what I generally like to say about it is that I see this as a moment where very much so there's an attempt to infantilize hip hop, right? And what I mean by that, you know, if you look at a form now that is 35 years old, and when you look at some of the folks who are most prominent in it in terms of their investment in hip hop as a culture, these are folks who are all in their 40s and their 50s. I'm a 42-year-old man, right? And if we could imagine what hip hop looked like, or what hip hop, if hip hop was a person, right? What kind of decisions a person makes when it's 35 years old around paying mortgages and 401ks and daycare and minivans and all these kinds of things, right? And you have a generation of folks who are connected to hip hop both as artists, but also as folks in terms of running corporations and have other connections into hip hop who are growing up and attempting to grow up the culture with them, right? And why this attack at this particular moment? Because I keep wondering whether or not there's a sudden notion of realizing that as hip hop is now growing up and maturing, and I'll use JayZs as a quick example of this in a second, and growing up and maturing, right, you also realize that hip hop now has a capacity to impact, specifically in the context of politics and public policy. So that when the Chicago Tribune in April does an op-ed, right after the Imus stuff is going down, criticizing Hillary Clinton, right? Because she had been accepting campaign money from the hip hop producer Timbaland, right? And Timbaland has regularly over the last year been hosting fundraising events for Hillary Clinton from his home in Miami, right? And rather than celebrate the fact that you have a generation of hip hop folks now engaged in the political process, think about this for a second, right? The kind of thing we would have never expected from a hip hop artist, right? And it's not just him. 50 Cent is also a big Hillary Clinton supporter, right? Has held fundraisers for her. Right? Rather than celebrate hip-hop growing up and actually being involved in the political process, what we get is a pushback. Hillary, how can you take this money from Timbaland, right? And again, Timbaland doesn't rap, right? So to actually find...
He does something on those albums.
Well, yeah, but nobody buys those albums because he's rapping, right? It's all about what he does musical. And my point being is like, if you got to look for some Timbaland lyrics to be offensive, right? Because no one's listening. Even if you find them, no one's listening to them, right? So when you see that kind of pushback, right, you have to wonder now that hip hop is beginning to flex its muscles in certain kinds of ways politically, whether or not this infantilization of hip hop is an attempt to cool that down, right? Now, of course, when we look at the 2004 election, we saw an unprecedented number of hip hop generation folks go to the polls, right? The reason why it didn't have a dramatic impact because you saw an even larger extension of folks who never voted before, particularly religious right folks, getting to the process, and it muted the impact of him. hip-hop, right? Without the Republicans necessarily having a candidate that's going to bring those folks back out to the polls in 2008, hip-hop, and I think folks realized this very early on, represents a very particular kind of threat at this particular moment. And I wonder, again, if this is an attempt to infantilize what its influence is. I use an example of someone like JayZ, and not his most recent album, American Gangster, but Kingdom Come. Right? And this was someone who's now 37 years old, and as someone who's running a label realizes that his hip-hop is going to continue to be successful as a musical genre, right? That has primarily made its money selling to kids who are 14 to 25, that there are now folks like Mario and myself.
30's the new 20.
Right,
So,
who've been listening to this stuff
it's on the album.
for 25 years and are still discerning hip-hop connoisseurs, right? Who don't want to hear about what 17-year-olds are talking about, right? But actually wouldn't mind listening to some hip-hop that reflects what our lives are at 42 years old, right?
39, thank you.
Okay. And this question, like, why can't hip-hop be country music, right? If you listen to country music, right, it's this wide breadth of stories, right? Gas is too high, I can't go to work today, right? People make songs about that, right? Right? Gas is too high, I ain't got no bus fare, my wife works, right? I really want my wife to stay at home, right, so I can drive the car. I mean, people make songs about this, right? Think about the range of narratives that you hear in hip-hop or don't hear in hip-hop, right? So you get JayZ doing something like Kingdom Come, and you know, the video he did for it was striking, right? Because it's a video where he's driving around someplace in France with Dale Jr., right? Hip-hop has gone NASCAR. Right? And part of that is about how do you create a marketplace for hip-hop for folks who don't listen to Lil Wayne, right? And could care less about Lil Wayne, right? But actually got mortgages to pay and got kids in daycare, right? And got to go out and buy a minivan, right? And a range of these kind of stories. And it's about trying to grow hip-hop up. So that when the Imus affair goes down, I remember listening to a black minister on the Today Show, right? And he just throws JayZ under the bus, right? All these bad rappers, JayZ, this person's like, okay, this is someone who has no clue what this is, hasn't listened to it, right? Because this is the other thing that kind of offended me about the Imus thing, right? Hip-hop and black culture in general, right, seems to be one of the few spaces in this country where folks who have no expertise in it,
Speak all day.
right, are allowed to give credible opinions of it, all right? So Stanley Crouch can always have a vehicle to talk about hip-hop, though he knows very little about it. The thing that Stanley Crouch actually knows a great deal about, jazz, he rarely has a forum to talk about that, right? But at the same token, no one would ever put a mic in Stanley Crouch's mouth, right, or anybody walking down the block and ask them what they think about Matisse paintings, right? Everybody feels quite okay putting a mic in anybody's mouth, right? My parents, right? How do you feel about hip-hop? I hate it, right? Well, Mom, when's the last time you listened to hip-hop? Never, right? And of course, we never go to that particular part of the question. So I think it's a very complicated moment, right? How do we hold artists accountable, right? How, as Gwen Pugh argues, do we recognize that very often hip-hop does the grunt work for the patriarchy, right? So hip-hop becomes the target of these conversations without us never really dealing with these larger inequalities, right? But at the same token, the only reason why we have these conversations, right, as you argue, right, is because of hip-hop. So thank you, and we'll open this up.
I want to say on your point about if you remove the three words, I went to Wikipedia and just put in racial epithet, and without ever seeing the N-word, hundreds of words that could fill the space that you would. I almost titled the paper once "Buffy, Quashi, and Teapot" because each one of those are words that stands in for the N-word.
Absolutely.
So you could the meaning can always be communicated.
Absolutely.
The word is irrelevant.
Right.
Wow. I'm smart enough to know when to keep my mouth shut. I'll just open it up to you for questions and comments and feedback. Yes.
For Professor Neal, you were saying that the content of a lot of mainstream hip-hop is dictated in part by the demands of the mass consumers and in part by the decisions made by the corporations in collusion with the radio. I was wondering if there are any specific examples where those two interests collided, or which do you think, I guess, predominates?
Well, I think there clearly has been a historical narrative in this country about the presentation of black masculinity in certain kind of demonic ways, right? And it's a weird dynamic, right, where America in general was very fearful of black masculinity, but in love with black masculinity at the same time, right?
The
And
sports.
50 Cent, right? You're seeing the sports, right? So someone like 50 Cent, is a great example of this kind of interesting dynamic, right? 50 Cent is not the kind of person that the average white American would like to see move in their neighborhood, right? But at the same time, can really, be interested in the beauty of his body, right? For instance, and his physicality. So I think more often than not, right, it's about the allowance for the certain presentation of narratives coming from black men and black people in general that becomes this kind of vicarious experience of the other without necessarily having to live with the other or be the other. So I think that's always been kind of a framing moment in the interest in hip hop. What's happened since 1996 is that, historically, when you look at forms of black popular music, it was always the attempt of artists trying to cross over to white audiences. My colleague Todd Boyd at USC makes a point that what happened with gangster rap is the audiences crossed over to hip hop, and hip hop never had to water down their narratives, right? It never had to become really the Will Smith hour, right? Will Smith had some success, but hip hop didn't have to reflect Will Smith in order to cross over, right? And in fact, it represented something in direct opposition to Will Smith, and still continued to sell more records than it had ever, in that context.
Yes.
Actually, I have two comments. I guess I should start with the one that I want to make sure to get in. First, much like you, I'm also a long time fan of hip hop and rap. Even though I wasn't as much a fan of it at the time, I do remember the event when Rappers Delight came out. It does sort of annoy me.
Monumental.
Yes, and it does sort of annoy me when I hear people talk about hip hop and rap as if it all started with Tupac Shakur.
Right.
I was quite a fan of Kumo D and Digital Underground. So, and in that sense, I would like to say that, as they say, back in the day, or as to show my age, back in my day, there was a great deal more variety in hip hop and rap. I mean, you had those who could be hard. You could have Big Daddy Kane, but of course you could have some who were relatively fun and partying. Digital Underground, you could have those who are politically active, motivate, has relevant messages, Public Enemies, Kumo D, KRS-One, and so I think that in some ways hip hop has sort of gone back from that variety. It still exists, but it's harder to find. Of course, much of that developed once with the great success of gangster rap. It just seems to, for a lot of people, when they think of hip hop and rap, they immediately think of gangster rap. And true, it is dominant, but there are other forms and other artists out there, but it's just, they're harder to find. And I think in that sense, actually, the market, people, interested consumers can help to motivate sort of that diversification of rap by putting their mouths where their monies are. I mean, if they could go out and actually search for these other artists and buy them. And also sort of related to your point about the sort of the variety of topics presented in rap, you compared it to country music. There are some genres which within rap which present sort of similar. In fact, I myself, I am a space physicist and proud geek, and accordingly, I am quite fond of geekster rap, those called nerdcore rap, and it's something that actually there are a great many of us in the geek community who hope that it can be used as a tool for science education and public outreach. And in fact, it is not as well known to some, but the physics funkmeister has recently relocated to Chapel Hill.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. All right.
Just 2 points, because one of them you made was this whole notion of who crossed over after gangster rap. What you actually had were those who were doing interesting, varieties or segments of rap emulating, right? So you had, Will Smith and, others, trying to go gangster for a moment in order to appease the market, which speaks to the point of commodification. And it's interesting that we, as an urban community, as an inner city community, as a black community, get asked to justify the negative uses and images, but it's suburban, middle class, whites who mostly buy that music. And so in some ways, the conversation we need to have about how we lead with our dollars needs to be a really integrated and diverse conversation in terms of a population.
I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, the irony is that, there are 3 points here, right, where we get to this moment, right? Run DMC's Raising Hell, right, which sells out the box, and of course they do that collaboration with Aerosmith, right, which shows white kids, right, are interested in hip hop, and then you have the explosion of the Beastie Boys. You get Yo MTV Raps with debuts in August of 1988 as a one-shot deal, right? And of course, MTV, right? MTV is a very epitome of cultural apartheid in this country up to this point in time, right? You could count on your hand, right, the number of black artists who were in regular rotation, if you want to even include Michael Jackson, up to 1988. All right, Yo MTV Raps debuts as a one-shot deal, and it's the highest rated show in the history of MTV. Right. The next month, right, you have a weekly show and a daily half-hour show, right? Changes the demographics, right? Corporate America picks up on that, right? And suddenly you see hip-hop, which had largely been produced by independent labels up to that point, all these artists are being signed by major labels, right? So the investments are very different. And then you get NWA, right? When they released Niggas for Life in 1991, which without any radio play, with no music video, with virtually no promotion, in the second week of its release, and this is right after SoundScan is introduced in earlier in 1991, the album goes to the top of the charts, right? So suddenly what you have is we can make money off this process, and it's this particular kind of rap music, right, that's going to do it. And then you get artists who make an exceptional amount of money, a smaller number, right, who make exceptional amount of money, and everyone needs to maintain their access to the money pool. So we get these authenticity conversations, right? That's why Ja Rule and 50 Cent have to go with each other, right? Because 50 Cent's appearance threatens the money stream for Ja Rule, right? Just the way the game, threatens that for 50 Cent and on down the line.
Okay, right here.
Well, I'm certainly not a
Could you
hip-hop.
speak loudly?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm certainly not a hip-hop connoisseur. Mostly what I know is what I hear on the radio or possibly on 106 cars. My depth knowledge is not great, but I thought it was really interesting what you said about the way that songs get on the radio. Because, for example, I had this really odd experience listening to, I think it was the last Rutgers album. And pretty much every other song is a song about growing up and how I'm an adult now and I have kids.
The song about runaway girls.
Yeah,
with Mary J.
I have to be a good example for them, and there's a whole song about being in church and confessing how you should treat your wife better, and because she's like the rock of your life and all this stuff. And there's a lot of songs about growing up and how hard it is to grow up and learn who you are. And every other song is like shake your moneymaker, and in a way that seemed very demeaning to women, and especially the comparison of women in these two songs. It's like, as an adult man, he wants to be very respectful of women and admire the role they play in his life as children's lives. And on the other hand, the stuff they got on the radio is the stuff about how women are basically objectified and we should put money in their songs. And I thought it was really interesting because the other songs I thought were not only better, they also had much more interesting stories to tell, but that's apparently not what people want. I think people find it boring to hear about, I'm going to be a responsible grown-up.
And he's actually successful enough that he has the option that he can have some amount of creative control, right? But again, it's a small minority of those artists who can do that. Most of them, particularly the young cats who just go into the studio, write these songs, right? They write those songs, record them, and if one of them sticks, they'll make 5 more of them.
Well, and that perverse kind of hypocrisy just is there, and it's not just ludicrous, it's all over the industry, even for artists who have capital, right? I mean, I think LL Cool J on 10 has a loving tribute to his wife and still has women shaking
Right.
in the videos, right? Separate from that, or wooing Gabrielle Union on a beach to a different song. And so the whole point is you have to sell. It is a product. It is commodification. But I think at least now, for some artists, they have the ability to speckle throughout the album a diversity that might speak to long in the tooth hip hop.
And it's bizarre. I mean, I use 50 Cent as an example. You don't sell 10 million records in this country unless you're selling to black, white, straight, gay, bi, et cetera, et cetera. And in the context of the music industry and hip hop in particular, as homophobic as hip hop is, right, the gay audience represents a significant audience for successful hip hop artists, right? And these are artists, in the case of 50 Cent, that very often are being styled by gay men. Right, the kind of oiling up, when you see 50 Cent, the oiling up of his chest, right? It's all this thing about black masculinity, but he is very conscious of the fact that he's also selling that image, right, to the very queers that he's bashing in his songs.
Veronica.
I'm wondering, I kind of hear you all separate hip hop from what's mainstream in a way, and also kind of including it under the same label. I guess I'm wondering about the Soulja Boys and the young JayZs who are the major influence on today's youth, and who are a major influence on the way they carry themselves, the way they speak, or I guess I'm still a youth. It's a big influence. So that's where I'm concerned. I'm not so much concerned about hip hop that's not played. That is, because I do listen to hip hop, a lot of music that is socially conscious and that is positive music. But the stuff that's played and the stuff that's really having an impact is the stuff that tells young girls that you can sleep with as many men as you want, and young men that you disrespect the young women.
And that's a legitimate critique. When Kathy Cohen got $600,000, Kathy Cohen, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago, she got $600,000 from the Ford Foundation 2 years ago, basically to do a study of opinions of young folks in America. And part of what she wanted to do was to get young folks to respond to what they're hearing in rap music, right? Why they buy it, why they're listening to it. And there's been lots of studies around hip-hop pedagogy where Kathy Cohen's findings have been borne out. But essentially, when you ask kids, right, what she found out, for instance, in the survey, is about 70% of all young black girls who listen to hip-hop find the lyrics offensive, right? Even more telling, more than 60% of young black boys who listen to hip-hop find the lyrics, right, offensive. And what young folks will tell you over and over again is that initially they never pay attention to the lyrics, right? It's all about the quality of the production. Right? There's all kinds of conversations now about why hip-hop wasn't what it was 30 years ago, right, or 20 years ago. And in terms of lyrical content, that's a legitimate claim. But in terms of production value, it's you can't listen to hip-hop from 20 years ago because it sounds bad, right? But the kids are responding to the production values musically of hip-hop, right? And they're not listening to the lyrics. Where this becomes an issue is when the lyrics become an issue is when the same offensive song is paid 27 times a day and being beat into their head. And that's when it stops being an issue about the artist, but who's behind the mechanism that gets this stuff played over and over again. If you hear something 27 times a day, it's at some point you start to pay attention to what you're listening to.
There also just a way in which that whole Soulja Boy thing, it becomes about the complete product. You love the dance, right? That's what you want to do. The dance. You don't know what Superman means in the song. Right? I certainly didn't, and was offended to learn. But you love the dance, the production value. But we do find the archetype in ways legally and socially offensive, because what you start to read after you get these videos with rap artists and their pants down among their waists and belted is now these kind of local ordinances that want to fine young men for wearing their pants off their heads, right? And so there are ways because we don't want kids in the suburbs dressing like that when they see it on the video. And so there's ways in which we realize the ways in which things that could be a form of even an esoteric or very limited variety of hip hop become, embraced by larger audiences and have an ability to affect kids, and that is the genre that receives criticism, and then then they ask young blacks to then justify why there's problems.
I have a question about, take the example of the song where the kids really like it, but they do find the words offensive, but then it's played 27 times and kind of, it eventually has an impact. I just wonder if that song that ends up being so popular, but does have very derogatory language in it, would be as popular without that derogatory language. And it seems like some of those songs that are quite popular and really circulate themselves on that larger market, would that be so without the derogatory language? And then kind of secondly and related, how do we relate that back to the market and the decisions made by the corporations that either choose to have those songs be the kind of front line, what's going to be the moneymaker, and that relation to those suburban kids and to much of the white population that only really, like you said, will appreciate a certain embodiment of a black man or of black culture, but yet, the example is not want them to be their neighbor. I'm just curious about, those connections.
That's a good question. I take the example of KRS-One, who is held in high regard for his political consciousness and a range of other things. I defy you to find a KRS-One song that he's produced in the last 20 years that you can dance to. And I make that point is that, exactly what you're saying, right? If it's about the production values, why not produce music that has different lyrics but has the same production values that can be successful? And if you accept the argument that when you look at hip-hop, the hip-hop, no matter who the audience is, and I want to kind of tease that, disturb that a little bit also, no matter who's buying, we presume, are buying hip-hop, hip-hop is always seen as a black art form. And there's rarely been an instance in the history of American society in which the marketplace has been interested in complicating what blackness is. Right, and to talk about other images that don't buy into these certain kind of stereotypes about black masculinity and black women in general is to complicate blackness in ways that the marketplace has never affirmed, right? Because in some ways they can't control that. All right, and again, when you talk about the gatekeepers, the gatekeepers most often or not, right, are not young black folks who don't have connections to black communities to be able to distinguish those kind of dynamics. But in terms of the audience piece, there's been a long circulating notion that 70 or 80% of who buys mainstream rap music are white kids. And of course, the simple pushback on that is, how the hell would you ever measure that, right? And SoundScan, who's responsible for us knowing what's being bought and sold, they don't have a dynamic within the way that they do what they do to measure, right, race and gender and class in terms of who's buying rap music. What they can measure are areas, right? So if you presume that there are a certain amount of music that's being bought in certain suburban enclaves, okay, it must be white kids, right? But of course that presumes that black kids don't also live in those suburban spaces. That given the dearth of record stores in actual black communities, that black kids don't get in cars, hop on buses, right, hop on the trains and travel out to these suburban malls along with their white peers who may live in suburbia. So it's hard to make the argument, right, that it's primarily white kids who are buying, though it's clearly white kids who the labels and the corporation are trying to target. And again, because we've rarely had an instance where blackness has ever been complicated in the mainstream marketplace, there simply has not yet been a formula that's going to allow for that to be successful. Now, the one big pushback that we start to see now because of technology is that you ask anybody under the age of 18 whether or not they listen to the radio. Right, and a large number of them will go, I never listened to the radio, right? And radio has historically been the primary platform for people to access music. What you find out because of iPods and other online sites, the kids now are relying less on radio, right, to get access to the music and are starting to try and find stuff themselves. I mean, MySpace is a great example of this. You know, the recording industry itself now actually has very little to do with music. I mean, look at someone like T-Pain, right? T-Pain's success, besides writing great hooks, is that he sells more ringtones. Right, so he's producing music not for consumption as music, but as ringtones on your phone, right? So, you know, even the whole system now is really eroding in the way that it's functioned over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think that's going to raise real possibilities and new possibilities for what kind of music can be made and who can listen to it and what the content looks like within that context, right? How do you explain someone like an MF Doom, for instance, right, who basically is, you know, had a career for the last 10 years writing about comic books and recording about comic books and has a strong audience that follows him, and he's never been heard on the radio.
Okay, I know that classes are going to resume shortly. We have time for one more question if you formulate it in an abbreviated fashion.
It seems to me that the difficult part of the whole discussion about hip hop is what exactly is it that we're criticizing? Because if what we're criticizing is the use of certain language and the use of certain concepts, well then that argument could be made for almost any genre.
Absolutely.
In pop music, promiscuous women are promoted, if not through the lyrics, but through the way our female pop artists dress. I mean,
Absolutely.
every group does it. So at what point do we say it's okay because music isn't meant to be fun and not meant to be some forum for a scholarly debate, and instead place responsibility on the people who use those words inappropriately? I mean, is it even right to be having such discussions that criticize this use when it's meant to just be fun?
I suggested that I think it's difficult to look at the use in the one genre, hip hop, rap music, and then suggest legitimately then that that if there are problems in the way it's used there, that there also you know, that might be linked to the ways in which you know, legally we have a problem with the people using the words in an oppressive manner. But the problem is hip hop is everywhere. It commands so much public attention and discourse that much like in the wake of Imus, if you don't start having a conversation about accountability, then you are accused of giving it a pass for the way its expressive images are homophobic, misogynistic, in which they have a dynamic of racial oppression that they don't own up to. And that's why the question is whether it's scapegoating or not, or whether it's legitimate to ask an expressive art form that has so much impact to be more responsible in the way certain words and images are conveyed. And I think we haven't reached a good balance between what is fair to ask hip hop or rap music more particularly. But I think we're past the moment of simply saying it's meant to be fun and entertainment and expressive, because that doesn't solve the problem.
I think it's incredibly problematic that we spend more time talking about sexist and misogynist lyrics and not talking about sexism and misogyny.
Right.
I mean, that just strikes me as bizarre, you know.
And on that note, I wanted to make two comments, and maybe I should not. If you want to read more about how the very institutions that are criticizing hip-hop culture perpetuate patriarchy, misogynistic thinking, sexism, I would highly recommend Professor Neal's New Black Man, which was published in 2005, I believe. And also on this point that Professor Barnes made, I call it the Imus syndrome, right, where if you have oppressed populations or subordinated groups participating in certain behavior, somehow it excuses the behavior. It's not just unique to the Imus situation. If you think about some of the criticisms of slavery, right, many people will say, well, Africans participated in the slave trade, so it can't be that bad if they were actually selling their own people, right? So you hear this critique in that situation in police brutality cases, right? Often when these cases go down, I'll hear people say, well, was one of the officers black? As if participation by a group member of the group who's being harmed negates the severity of the problem. So I think there's a larger issue that one could tease out in addition to this connection with hip-hop that unfortunately we don't have time to do today. Let me just tell you, Professor Neal is on campus, and if you want to hear more of his commentary and critique on these issues, then you can go to his blog spot, newblackman.com, and we'll just have to invite Professor Barnes back for another occasion. Thank you very much for coming. Oh.